He introduced me to my sister's fiancé the way you'd introduce someone who'd shown up uninvited. "This is Claire," my father said, his hand already turning away before he'd finished the sentence. "She's between things right now." Between things. That was how he described me at my sister Fiona's engagement dinner. 42 people seated around 2 long tables in the private room of a Cantonese restaurant in Richmond Hill, and my father chose that moment, that phrasing, to explain my existence. Julian, my sister's fiancé, the man I was meeting for the first time, reached across and shook my hand. He was tall, composed in a way that felt earned rather than performed. He smiled and said it was nice to meet me, and I said the same, and my father had already moved on to talking to someone else. I sat down next to my mother and folded my napkin across my lap and told myself it didn't matter. It always mattered. I just kept telling myself it didn't. I should give you the background because without it none of this makes sense. I'm the middle child. Fiona is 2 years older than me. She's a real estate agent in Markham. She has beautiful hair. She calls my parents every Sunday. My brother Elliot is 3 years younger than me. He's in finance. He golfs with my father. He has 2 kids who my parents take to Canada's Wonderland every summer. I am the one who moved away. I am the one who didn't call enough. I am the one who came home for Christmas looking tired, or distracted, or, my mother's word, strange. I'm a trauma surgeon at Sunnybrook. I've been there for 6 years. Before that I did my residency at Toronto Western, and before that I was at McGill, and before that I grew up in a beige house in Markham, where my father ran a logistics company, and my mother taught piano, and I spent most of my adolescence wanting something I couldn't name. I became a surgeon because I was good at it, and because it mattered, and because somewhere in the middle of my 2nd year of medical school, I understood that this was the thing I was supposed to do. I didn't do it for my parents. I don't think they ever quite forgave me for that. My father isn't a cruel man. I want to be fair about that. He's not someone who would ever raise his voice, who would ever say anything directly unkind. He's the kind of man who uses tone and timing and the careful omission of words to communicate everything he thinks. He's been telling me for 15 years that I've made disappointing choices, and he has never once said it out loud. He didn't need to. Between things was a new one though. Even for him. The dinner was to celebrate the engagement. Fiona and Julian had been together for 3 years. They'd met in Vancouver when Julian was posted out there and Fiona was attending a conference. They'd done long distance for a year before he transferred back east. The proposal had happened 2 months ago, on a dock at a cottage in Muskoka, and my mother had cried when Fiona sent the photo. I'd called Fiona the same night. I liked Julian. From what I knew of him, which at that point wasn't much, he seemed steady and kind and genuinely devoted to my sister. That was enough for me. I'd taken 2 days off to be there. This is not a small thing. People who don't work in hospitals don't always understand what it means to carve 2 consecutive days out of that kind of schedule. I'd arranged coverage, I'd briefed the resident taking over my cases, I'd driven up from the city the night before and slept in my old bedroom under the same duvet I'd had in university. None of that was visible to anyone at that table. What was visible was that I'd arrived without a partner. What was visible was that I looked tired, because I am always tired. What was visible was that I ordered sparkling water instead of wine, which my Aunt Beverly commented on twice. And what was visible, apparently, was that I was between things. Julian was seated across the table and 3 spots to the left. For most of the first hour I didn't speak to him directly. There were too many people, too many conversations layered over each other. My father holding court at one end about the port of Halifax and container shipping delays. My Aunt Beverly asking Fiona about venues at the other. I talked to my mother mostly. She asked about my apartment and I told her I'd repainted the kitchen. She asked if I was seeing anyone and I said not currently. She asked if I was eating properly and I said yes, and she gave me the look that means she doesn't believe me. I talked to my cousin Daphne, who is 26 and doing her master's in environmental policy at Dalhousie and is one of the most genuinely curious people I've ever met. She asked me what the most surprising thing I'd learned in surgery was, and I told her about proprioception, about how experienced surgeons develop a kind of spatial memory in their hands that operates faster than conscious thought. And her eyes went wide and she asked 17 follow-up questions. That was a good 20 minutes. Then the main dishes arrived and the seating reshuffled the way it always does when food appears, and I found myself across from Julian. He was talking to Elliot about something when I sat down. Hockey, I think. Elliot coaches a kids' league in the winter and he can talk about it for stretches that defy explanation. Julian was nodding and asking genuine questions, which is harder than it sounds when Elliot is on the topic of hockey. When there was a pause, Julian looked at me. Fiona mentioned you're a doctor, he said. I told him I was. What kind surgery? Trauma, mostly. He nodded. There was something in his expression that shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration. Sunnybrook? Yeah, good hospital, he said, and it wasn't flattery. He said it the way someone says it when they know what it means. I asked how he knew it, and he told me he'd spent 2 weeks there 7 years ago, not as a patient but as part of a liaison assignment. He said he'd found the trauma unit specifically interesting to observe. The way decisions had to be made in compression. The communication under pressure. He said he had a lot of respect for the people who did that work. I didn't press further. I didn't yet know what Julian did. Fiona had told me he was military, that he was based in Ottawa now, that he'd had a long career. She hadn't said more than that, and I hadn't asked. It wasn't really my business, and I didn't want to seem like I was cataloging credentials. Across the table, my father was explaining to someone how the shipping industry had changed since COVID. He gestured with his chopsticks in a way that meant he was at the good part of the story. He didn't look at us once. The rest of dinner passed the way these dinners pass. Dessert came. Mango pudding and egg tarts, and tea, and then the small speeches. My father stood up and said how proud he was of Fiona, how Julian was a fine man, how the family was growing. He talked for 8 minutes. He mentioned Fiona's work 4 times, mentioned Elliot's children twice, mentioned my mother's piano students once. He did not mention me. I counted, sitting there. I actually counted. Elliot gave a short toast that was mostly jokes about Fiona's stubbornness and got laughs. Fiona's friend Wendy said something sweet about the proposal. Julian's sister, who I hadn't met yet, a woman named Harriet who'd flown in from Calgary, said something that made Fiona cry in a good way. I held my teacup and kept my face arranged in an expression that I hoped looked like warmth. After the speeches, when the room relaxed back into conversation, my father came around the table to talk to Julian. He sat down in the empty chair beside him, in what had been Harriet's seat, and he put one hand on the table like he was settling in. I was 2 seats away. I could hear everything. My father asked Julian about Ottawa, about whether he liked living there, about whether he and Fiona were thinking of staying or moving. Julian said they were still figuring it out. My father asked about Julian's work, the way he asks everyone about work, with the air of a man assessing the stability of a structure. Julian said he was at National Defense Headquarters. My father nodded. Military, he said, and it wasn't a question. Yes, Julian said. I'm wrapping up my current posting. 31 years. Good career, my father said. And then, I don't know what made him do it, whether it was the wine or the occasion or just the particular confidence of a man at his daughter's engagement dinner. My father leaned slightly toward Julian and said with a small laugh, "She has the longest hours of anyone I know and nothing to show for it." He nodded in my direction. Claire, always working. Never amounted to much to look at from the outside. He laughed again. The kind of laugh that asks the room to agree with it. My face went very still. I felt it go still the way it does in the OR when something unexpected happens. A flatline, a bleed, a wrong turn. That moment before action where everything clarifies down to a single point. Julian didn't laugh. There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds. In a room full of conversations, those 2 seconds were nothing. To me, they were enormous. Julian turned to look at me. He looked at me the way I've watched consultants look at a scan, carefully, specifically, with the full weight of what they know. He looked at the way I was sitting, he looked at my face, and then something happened behind his eyes that I can only describe as recognition. He turned back to my father. "How long has Claire been at Sunnybrook?" he asked. My father blinked. "I'm not sure exactly." "A few years. 6 years," I said. I hadn't meant to speak. The words came out very level. Julian nodded. He reached for his tea. "The trauma unit at Sunnybrook is one of the top in the country," he said. "They're the designated trauma center for the entire North Toronto region. 24-hour coverage, about 1,000 major trauma cases a year." He paused. "The surgeons who staff it are among the most skilled in Canada." My father said nothing. His expression was doing something complicated. Julian looked at me again. "Chief?" he asked. "Associate chief," I said. "Since January." He set his tea down. He looked at me for a long moment across the table, and what I saw in his face was not pity. I would have hated pity, but something more like acknowledgement. The kind you give someone when you know exactly what they're doing and how hard it is. "You run a trauma unit," he said. "I command a base. I know what it costs." He paused. "I don't think nothing to show for it is the right accounting." The table had gone quieter. I wasn't sure by how much. I was aware of my mother's stillness to my left, of Daphne watching from the far end, of Elliot pretending to be interested in his tea. My father had the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground under him is different from what he thought. Julian didn't make a scene of it. He didn't press. He just said it, and let it sit there, and then turned to Harriet's empty seat and asked my father something about the restaurant, about whether he'd been to Richmond Hill long, something easy and transitional. The conversation moved on. But the thing had been said. I went to the washroom after and stood at the sink for a minute. I looked at my hands, which is something I do when I need to remember who I am. They're not elegant hands, they're surgeon's hands. Short nails, a few small scars from years ago steady. They know what they're doing. They've always known what they're doing. I thought about calling someone when I got back to my room that night. My friend Sonia, maybe, or my residency colleague Paul, who would have said something appropriately dark and funny. I didn't call anyone. I stood at the sink and I breathed, and then I washed my hands out of habit. The full surgical scrub, 20 seconds, which is something I've done so many times it's become involuntary under stress, and I dried them and went back out to the table. Julian was talking to Fiona when I came back. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a nod, small and unhurried, the kind of thing you only notice if you're looking for it. I nodded back. That was enough. Later, when the dinner was ending and people were getting their coats, Julian found me near the door. I should have said this better, he said quietly. I wasn't trying to embarrass your father. You didn't embarrass him, I said. He recovered fine. I noticed what he said. I looked at him. I noticed too. I know, he said. That's why I said something. I wasn't sure what to do with that. People don't usually say something. I've had 15 years of experience learning to manage this alone, 15 years of arriving at family events and leaving them and repackaging what happened into something I could carry without it showing. I have a very efficient system for it. It works well. It works because nobody interferes. Julian stood there with his coat over his arm, and he looked like someone who had made a considered decision and was not second-guessing it. He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look like he was waiting for me to thank him. I said, "You've been at this a long time." He understood what I meant. "Long enough," he said. "You learn to recognize when someone's contribution isn't being read correctly." 31 years, I said. 31 years, he said. I asked him then, because I was curious, and because he'd been direct with me and I thought he'd earned a direct question, what his rank was. Fiona had kept it vague and I hadn't pressed. He told me, Brigadier General, Canadian Armed Forces, currently finishing a posting as Deputy Commander of 4th Canadian Division. I was quiet for a moment. Fiona didn't mention that, I said. He smiled. Fiona doesn't lead with it. I like that about her. I thought about my father at dinner, asking about work with the tone of a man assessing structural integrity. I thought about the expression on his when Julian had said what he said about Sunnybrook. I thought about between things. Thank you, I said, for what you said in there. Julian shook his head, once slight. I have a sister, he said simply. Driving back to the city the next morning, I got a text from Fiona. It said, he told me what he said, I'm sorry about Dad. Also, I'm so glad you two finally met. I wrote back, me too, he's good, Fi. She sent back a string of hearts, which is pure Fiona, and then, he said you were impressive. He doesn't say that about many people. I set my phone down and drove. The 404 South was empty at that hour. Just the gray October morning and the trees going gold on either side, and I had the particular feeling I sometimes get after a hard case. Not quite relief but a kind of loosening, the sense of something that had been clenched slowly finding its proper shape. My father hadn't apologized. I didn't expect him to. He would fold what happened into his understanding of Julian. He would decide that Julian was being loyal to his future family, that the comment had been protective rather than corrective, and he would move forward in the comfortable belief that nothing structural had changed. Maybe nothing structural had changed. But I'd driven up to Richmond Hill as Claire, the middle child, the one who was between things, who had nothing to show for it, who never amounted to much from the outside. And I'd driven back as myself. That's not nothing. After 15 years, that is not nothing at all. I was in the OR by 7 the following Tuesday. It was a bad case, a 19-year-old from a car accident on the 401, internal bleeding, second surgery within 18 hours. The resident on call was good but shaken. I talked him through the key decision points the way I talk people through things now. Not loudly, not quickly, but with the particular quality of certainty that takes a long time to earn. We closed at 11:40. The patient went to ICU stable. In the scrub room after, the resident, a third-year named Thomas who is going to be exceptional, pulled off his mask and looked at the ceiling and breathed. How do you do that? He said. I looked at my hands at the sink. You practice, I said, and then one day you realize the practice is the thing, not what it's building toward. The practice itself. He thought about that. I dried my hands and I went back to work.